I'll defend you. The black maid who saved a mafia boss after his lawyer abandoned him in court. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the judge banged his gavel. The mafia boss sat at the defendant's table, his usual icy composure failing him. His lawyer had just walked out. Not in protest, not in argument, but simply left, abandoning him when he needed legal counsel the most. It was a moment that could easily end in disaster. The room filled with whispers, and the mafia boss, known for his ruthlessness and power, now looked like a man on the edge of defeat. His reputation, his empire, everything he had built was hanging by a thread. The judge, visibly annoyed by the disruption, turned his gaze toward the mafia boss. "Do you have a lawyer, or will you represent yourself?" the judge asked, his voice cold. The mafia boss remained silent, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He had never been in a position like this before, and yet there he was, powerless in front of a room full of people. The gallery murmured, some with pity, others with a sense of glee. They knew this was the moment when everything could crumble. Suddenly, a faint voice broke through the noise. "I'll defend you," a woman's voice said, barely above a whisper. It was the black maid, the woman who had been quietly cleaning the courthouse floor during the proceedings. She was the last person anyone would expect to step forward in such a critical moment. But she did. With a calm resolve, she walked past the guards and made her way toward the front of the room. Her eyes locked onto the mafia boss, who now looked at her with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The courtroom fell silent as she stood beside him, her posture firm, her expression unwavering. "Excuse me," the mafia boss said, his voice low but edged with disbelief. "Are you offering to defend me?" She nodded, her voice steady as she spoke. "I believe I know the law better than your lawyer. I can help you." The words hung in the air, leaving the mafia boss stunned. The people in the courtroom looked at each other, unsure of what to make of this sudden turn of events. What would a maid know about legal defense? But the woman didn't back down. She had been a witness to everything unfolding and saw the holes in the lawyer's argument. She knew what needed to be done, and she was determined to fight for justice. The mafia boss, still unsure, nodded slightly. "Fine. I'm listening," he said, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. The black maid stood there, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders, but she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. This was her chance to prove that even in a world dominated by power and corruption, the truth and intellect could still find a way to prevail. The courtroom was silent, a heavy tension hanging in the air. The black maid, whose name was Angela, stood before the mafia boss, her gaze unwavering. She had just made the boldest decision of her life. Defend a powerful mafia boss? The very idea seemed absurd, yet here she was, ready to challenge the odds. Angela was a maid, yes, but not one to be underestimated. In her years of cleaning, organizing, and listening, she had picked up more than just the art of tidying up. She had an ear for details, a mind for strategy, and a heart that always sought fairness. She had grown up in the shadows, but she had never allowed her circumstances to define her. As she looked at the mafia boss, Dominic Romano, his face showed a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He had been one of the most feared men in the city, his empire stretching across industries from nightlife to construction. Yet, in this moment, he was vulnerable, abandoned by his lawyer in a courtroom that could seal his fate. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes studying Angela with a growing sense of intrigue. "You say you can defend me?" he asked, his voice low but intense. Angela nodded. "I believe I can. I've been paying attention. I understand the case. I know what's missing." She stepped forward, the eyes of the courtroom now fully on her. Angela had no law degree, no experience as an attorney, but she had something far more valuable, the ability to think on her feet. As she spoke, she began to piece together the flaws in the arguments presented so far. "The prosecution has no solid evidence," she said. "They're relying on circumstantial testimony and assumptions. What they've failed to see is the lack of concrete proof linking you to the crime." The courtroom was still, the silence broken only by the sound of her voice. Dominic's gaze softened slightly. He had not expected a maid, someone with no formal education, to be so composed and confident. "And how exactly do you know all this?" he asked. Angela's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "I've worked in places where I overheard discussions, where I noticed things that others didn't. I saw what the prosecutor failed to see. This case is weak, and you need someone who can connect the dots. There was a pause. Dominic leaned forward, studying her. You're certain? He asked. You're not just trying to get out of this mess? Angela's eyes met his without hesitation. I'm certain, she said. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Dominic found himself listening to someone who wasn't intimidated by his power. Angela continued. You have a history of manipulation and power plays, but you're not the only one with leverage. I've heard enough to know what your lawyer should have argued, but didn't. The judge's bias against you could have been neutralized with the right approach. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. And I have a way to make that happen. Dominic's mind was racing. This woman, this maid, was speaking with more authority than he had heard in weeks. She wasn't just reacting to the situation. She was controlling it. He could see the gears turning in her mind. You really think you can win this? He asked again, the disbelief still clear in his voice. Angela took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, I'm not going to let them take you down without a fight. Let me do this. Dominic looked around the courtroom, his empire flashing before his eyes. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was teetering on the edge of collapse. He needed someone who could fight for him, and, surprisingly, he found himself placing that trust in Angela. All right, he said, his voice hardening with resolve. Do what you have to do. The room seemed to breathe again as Angela turned toward the judge, her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to enter uncharted territory, but for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The trial wasn't over, but it was about to take a turn, and Angela was ready to turn the tide. As she prepared to speak, she could feel the weight of the entire courtroom on her shoulders. The Mafia boss, a man who controlled the lives of many, was now relying on her to save his own. Angela had never been one to back down, and today, she was about to prove that intellect and integrity could sometimes be more powerful than fear and money. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Angela, the black maid, stood confidently in front of the judge. Dominic Romano, the feared Mafia boss, sat silently at the defendant's table, his eyes locked on Angela with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. It had been only moments since he had reluctantly placed his fate in her hands, and now she was about to prove her worth. Angela had never imagined this day would come, where her quick thinking and quiet observations would lead her to this moment, standing in the courtroom, ready to fight for a man who had lived his life by a code of power and fear. She had spent years cleaning up after the wealthy and the powerful, overhearing their conversations, watching their every move, learning their secrets. She had seen the way the rich and powerful played the game, and though she had never had the opportunity to participate in it, she had always known that one day she might. Now, she was here, standing up not just for justice, but for a man who could change the course of her life with a single word. Angela turned her attention back to the judge. The silence in the room was deafening as she stepped forward and addressed the court. Your Honor, I would like to address the court's previous misconceptions about the evidence presented, she began, her voice calm but firm. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but she didn't let the pressure affect her. This was her moment, and she was going to take it. The case against Mr. Romano is built on circumstantial evidence and false assumptions. The prosecution has failed to provide any concrete evidence that directly links him to the crime in question, she continued, each word deliberate and carefully chosen. The courtroom was silent, as the judge glanced at the prosecutor, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What do you propose, miss? The judge asked, his tone skeptical but curious. Angela Williams, she replied confidently. I propose that we examine the key pieces of evidence the prosecution has overlooked. Angela stepped forward, pulling out a stack of papers from her briefcase. She knew she didn't have much time. She could feel Dominic's eyes on her, but she didn't let his presence intimidate her. Instead, she focused on the facts, on the inconsistencies in the case that no one else had bothered to notice. The primary witness for the prosecution is a person who claims to have seen Mr. Romano at the scene of the crime. But what they fail to mention is that the witness was never in a position to actually see Mr. Romano. They were on the opposite side of the building, and their testimony is based purely on assumptions. Angela glanced up at Dominic, his dark eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand how this woman could know so much. She didn't break eye contact. Furthermore, Angela continued. The physical evidence presented is inconclusive. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that directly ties Mr. Romano to the scene. The prosecution is relying on hearsay and flawed testimony to make their case. The courtroom was still, the weight of her words sinking in. Angela had done her homework, and she could see that the judge was starting to reconsider the validity of the case against Dominic. She wasn't just defending him. She was exposing the flaws in the prosecution's argument. The room was filled with murmurs of surprise. Even the prosecutor was taken aback. Angela knew that the battle wasn't won yet, but she could feel the tide starting to shift. As she looked at Dominic, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected: respect. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, he was looking at her as more than just a maid. He was seeing her as a person, as an ally. Dominic's stoic expression softened slightly, and Angela could tell that he was beginning to realize that this woman, who had no formal legal training, was his best hope for survival. The judge cleared his throat and turned his gaze back to the prosecutor. "Mr. Allen, do you have any further rebuttal?" the judge asked, his voice stern. The prosecutor stood up, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, he began, but he was cut off by the judge's raised hand. "Enough," the judge said. "The court will reconvene in 1 hour. Mr. Romano, you will have a chance to speak, but it seems the defense is making some valid points." The courtroom was in chaos, with the prosecutor scrambling to regain control, but Angela stood tall, feeling a sense of power she had never felt before. She had done it. She had turned the case in their favor. As the judge called for a recess, Angela turned to Dominic, who stood slowly, his imposing figure towering over her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Dominic spoke. "You did it. I didn't think it was possible, but you did it." Angela simply nodded, her heart still racing. She had done what no one had expected her to do. She had taken on a powerful mafia boss's case, and she had won the first round. But she knew that the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The judge's gavel struck the desk with finality, signaling a brief recess in the court proceedings. Angela stood quietly, the weight of what she had just done sinking in. The first round had gone in their favor, but the real battle was far from over. She glanced over at Dominic Romano, who was sitting at the defense table, his arms crossed as he watched her with a newfound respect. The man who had ruled entire criminal empires, who had terrified countless people, was now looking at her as though she held the key to his survival. In the moments following the judge's announcement, the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Lawyers huddled together, the prosecutor still trying to regroup from the unexpected turn of events. Angela, however, remained calm. She knew this was just the beginning. As Dominic stood and made his way toward her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room, Angela braced herself for what came next. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to pull it off," Dominic said, his voice low but filled with genuine admiration. "But you've made me believe that maybe I've been looking at things all wrong." Angela met his gaze. "I didn't do it for you," she replied, her tone steady. "I did it for the truth. The case against you was built on lies. All I did was show that." Dominic smirked, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Maybe, but I'm not used to people speaking to me like that. Especially not someone in your position." Angela felt a strange sense of pride at his words. It wasn't about flattery, it was about being heard. It was about someone finally recognizing her value, not just as a maid, but as a person with intellect and insight. "I don't care about your position, Dominic," she said firmly. "I care about what's right. And right now, you need someone who can think clearly, not someone who will blindly follow orders." There was a long pause before Dominic spoke again, his tone more contemplative. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you before." "That's because you're used to power," Angela replied, her voice unwavering. "But power doesn't always win. Sometimes, it's about knowing the right move." Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time, Angela saw a glimpse of the man behind the mafia boss persona. He wasn't just a ruthless criminal. He was someone who had spent his life fighting to survive in a world that only respected strength. And in that moment, Angela realized that they weren't so different. Both had learned to survive by their wits, by their instincts. "What's the next step?" Dominic asked, his eyes now focused on her, waiting for her direction. Angela looked over at the prosecutor's table, where they were clearly trying to recover from the unexpected turn of events. She knew the next step was critical. "We need to keep the momentum going," she said. "The prosecution will try to hit us with everything they've got. We need to be ready to counter every argument, expose every weakness in their case." Dominic nodded, a sense of determination settling in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "But I'm going to need your help." Angela couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The Mafia boss, a man who could command armies and control vast networks, was now turning to her for guidance. It was a feeling she had never expected, and it stirred something inside her, a quiet sense of power, not the kind that came from money or status, but from knowledge and truth. "Let's focus on the facts," she said, her voice resolute. "The prosecution's case is weak. We know that. What we need now is to show the jury that there is no evidence connecting you to this crime. We need to make them question everything they've been told." Dominic looked at her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "I never thought I'd be relying on a maid for legal advice," he said, almost to himself. Angela turned to face him, her gaze steady. "You're not relying on me because I'm a maid," she said. "You're relying on me because I'm the only one who sees the truth." The courtroom doors swung open, signaling the end of the break. Angela and Dominic exchanged a glance, and in that moment, they both knew that the real test was just beginning. The prosecutor was going to fight hard, but Angela was ready. She had seen the flaws in the case, and she was determined to expose them. As they returned to their seats, Angela's heart raced, but she felt a calmness inside her, a confidence she hadn't known she was capable of. She wasn't just defending Dominic Romano, she was defending what was right. The case was far from over, but with Dominic now trusting her, she knew they had a chance to win. As the court reconvened, the atmosphere was tense, but Angela remained focused. The break had given her a few moments to regroup, but now the real challenge was ahead. The prosecutor had reassembled his strategy, and it was clear from his posture that he wasn't going to let this slip away easily. Angela could feel the weight of the room upon her shoulders, but she wasn't backing down. She had already proven that she understood the case better than anyone thought possible. Now, she had to finish what she had started. Dominic Romano, the Mafia boss who had sat in silence for much of the trial, now leaned toward Angela, his eyes filled with respect. She had earned it in the last hour by dismantling the prosecution's case with simple but irrefutable logic. "What's next?" he asked quietly, his voice still carrying the authority that had once commanded fear. Angela glanced around the room. The prosecutor had returned to his seat, his face set in a mask of concentration, ready for the next round. The judge, too, had taken his seat, his gavel raised to restore order. Angela knew that now, more than ever, she had to stay sharp. "Now we expose the lies," she said, her voice calm but steady. "We prove to the jury that everything they've heard from the prosecution is based on assumptions, not facts." Dominic nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "You have my full trust," he said, his tone steady. Angela couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at his words. The powerful Mafia boss, who had ruled with fear and intimidation, was now relying on her intellect to save his empire. It was an ironic twist, but Angela had no time for doubts. She had a job to do. "I'll take care of this," she said. As Angela stood before the jury, she felt her heart race, but her mind was clear. She knew the key points she needed to hit, the pieces of evidence she had gathered that had been ignored by the prosecution. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice cutting through the silence of the courtroom. "The case against Mr. Romano is based on a series of assumptions, half-truths, and manipulated testimonies. There is no solid evidence that directly ties him to the crime in question. Everything you've heard so far has been a narrative designed to provoke emotion, not based on fact." She paused for a moment, making eye contact with several of the jurors, watching them carefully as her words sank in. "The prosecution has presented a witness, but that witness has no credibility. They claim to have seen Mr. Romano at the scene, but they were on the opposite side of the building and were not in a position to identify anyone. Their testimony is flawed and unreliable." She could see some jurors nodding slightly, their skepticism evident. Angela had their attention now, and she needed to press forward. "And then there's the so-called physical evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no direct link to the crime scene. The only thing the prosecution has presented is an empty theory with no basis in reality. They've given you nothing but assumptions and speculation." Angela took a deep breath and looked directly at the jury. But here's the truth, she continued. The real evidence is in the details that the prosecution has ignored. Mr. Romano has an alibi that the prosecution conveniently overlooked. He was miles away at the time of the incident, with multiple witnesses to confirm his whereabouts. And yet, the prosecution wants you to believe he was at the scene, based on nothing but an unreliable witness. The silence in the room was thick as Angela's words hung in the air. She knew that she had the jury's attention now. So, I ask you, what kind of case is this? One built on lies, assumptions, and false witnesses? Or is it a case based on facts and truth? We have proven that Mr. Romano was not at the scene, and we've shown that the prosecution's case is based on a flimsy foundation. Angela stepped back for a moment, letting her words settle. She could see the judge's approving glance, the prosecutor's frustration. But most importantly, she could feel the jury's shifting perspective. The truth is, Mr. Romano has been wrongfully accused, Angela said, her voice firm. And it's up to you to see through the smoke and mirrors the prosecution has presented. We deserve justice, and that justice will only come when you make the right decision. As Angela finished, she returned to her seat, her heart still racing, but her mind at ease. She had said everything that needed to be said. The ball was now in the jury's court. Dominic, sitting quietly next to her, looked at her with admiration. That was incredible, he said softly. I think we have a real shot at this. Angela didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She had done everything she could to ensure that the truth was heard. Now, all that was left was for the jury to decide. The next few moments felt like hours as everyone waited for the jury's verdict. Angela could feel the tension building, but she remained calm. She had given it her all, and now the outcome was out of her hands. As the jury began to deliberate, Angela leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She had fought for what was right, and no matter what happened next, she knew she had done everything in her power to bring the truth to light. The waiting felt like an eternity. Angela sat in the courtroom, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. She had made her case, exposed the flaws in the prosecution's argument, and given it everything she had. Now, it was up to the jury. She glanced at Dominic, who was sitting next to her. His usually stoic demeanor had softened into something more human, admiration, respect. He looked at her like he had never looked at anyone before. He had trusted her, a maid, a woman with no legal training, to save him from the brink of ruin. And she had delivered. For a moment, their eyes met, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. She had proved that the truth mattered more than power, more than fear. And in that brief moment of connection, Angela realized something. She wasn't just helping Dominic. She was helping herself. All her life, she had been invisible. She had been the maid, the one who cleaned up after the powerful, the rich, the influential. She had always been overlooked, taken for granted, never given a second thought. But in this courtroom, she had stepped into the spotlight. She had used her intellect, her observation, and her knowledge of the world around her to turn the case around. She had shown that she was more than just a maid. She was someone who could change the course of events. Dominic shifted in his seat, and for the first time since the trial began, he smiled at her. It wasn't the cold, calculating smile he had used when he ruled over his empire. It was genuine. You did it, he said, his voice low but filled with a rare sense of awe. I didn't think it was possible, but you did it. Angela didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, feeling a rush of emotion she hadn't expected. They both turned as the judge called for the jury to return. The door creaked open, and the foreman of the jury stepped forward, holding the verdict. Angela's heart raced in her chest, the air thick with anticipation. The moment of truth had arrived. The judge turned to the jury. Have you reached a verdict? He asked, his voice echoing in the now quiet courtroom. The jury foreman nodded. We have, Your Honor. The room seemed to hold its breath as the foreman handed the verdict to the judge. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words. Angela's gaze shifted to Dominic, whose face had returned to its usual hard, unreadable expression. But she could see the subtle tension in his posture, the way his jaw clenched, waiting for the words that could determine his fate. In the case of the people versus Dominic Romano, the judge began. We the jury find the defendant not guilty on all charges. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Angela felt a weight lift from her chest, but it was a strange feeling, almost surreal. Not guilty. Dominic Romano, the powerful mafia boss, had been exonerated. The court had sided with the truth, not the lies that had been woven around him. The room erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in disbelief. The prosecution sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the turn of events. But Angela, for the first time, allowed herself to breathe. She had done it. She had won. Dominic stood up, his imposing figure towering over the room. He turned to Angela, a look of respect now fully evident in his eyes. "I owe you everything," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity she had never expected from him. "I never thought I would say this, but you saved me. You're the reason I'm walking out of here today." Angela stood up, her heart still racing. She didn't know how to respond. She had never expected gratitude from him, not in a million years. But now, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something more than just the mafia boss. She saw a man who, for the first time in his life, realized that power wasn't everything. "I did it because it was right," she said softly. "You're not the only one who needs a second chance." Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time, he seemed truly human. "I've never had anyone like you on my side," he said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. Angela smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She had changed the course of his life, but in doing so, she had changed her own as well. As they left the courtroom, the world outside seemed brighter, less intimidating. For the first time in years, Angela felt like she mattered. She had made a difference, not just for Dominic Romano, but for herself. And as she stepped out into the sunlight, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had proven that even in a world ruled by power, intellect, and integrity could still win the day. The days after the trial were a blur for Angela. She had won. The jury had found Dominic Romano not guilty, and she had successfully saved him from a life behind bars. But the reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in, and with it came an overwhelming sense of change. It was one thing to sit in a courtroom and make her case, to expose the flaws in the prosecution's arguments. But it was another thing entirely to face the aftermath. People were talking. Everywhere she went, whispers followed her. Whispers about the maid who had defended a mafia boss, the maid who had outsmarted a team of lawyers, the maid who had turned the tables on a system designed to protect the powerful. She had become a name, a story, but she had also become something else, someone worth noticing. Dominic had kept his word. He had promised her a life beyond the mundane, beyond cleaning and scrubbing floors, beyond being invisible. A week after the trial, he invited her to his office, a grand space high above the city skyline. The view was stunning, the buildings stretching out beneath them like a maze of glass and steel. Dominic sat behind his massive desk, his posture as imposing as ever, but there was something different about him now. His gaze was softer, more reflective, like the man who had once ruled with an iron fist was beginning to understand the value of kindness. "You've proven yourself, Angela," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with an emotion she had never expected from him. "You saved me. You changed everything." Angela sat across from him, her heart still racing from the recognition she had received since the trial. It felt surreal. Just a few weeks ago, she had been cleaning his mansion, invisible to everyone around her. Now, she was sitting across from the most powerful man in the city, someone who had built an empire, someone who commanded respect. "I didn't do it for you," Angela replied, her voice steady but calm. "I did it because I knew what was right." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know," he said quietly, "and that's why I trust you. You see the world differently from everyone else. You see things they don't." The weight of his words lingered in the air. Angela had always seen the world differently. She had learned to observe, to listen, to pick up on things that others ignored. It was a skill she had honed over the years, a skill that had saved not only Dominic, but had also opened doors for her, doors she had never imagined would be within reach. "What do you want, Angela?" Dominic's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked at him, unsure of what he meant. "I'm offering you a chance," he continued. "A chance to join my organization, to be more than just a maid. You've proven your worth, and I need someone like you." The offer was unexpected. Angela had spent her life in the shadows, in the background, never asking for more. She had always been content with her quiet existence. even though she had known deep down that she was capable of so much more. Now, Dominic was offering her the world. A position in his organization, one that would put her at the heart of power, wealth, and influence. But with that came risks. She would be stepping into a world where power was everything, where loyalty was tested, and where betrayal was a constant threat. The choice seemed impossible. She could continue to live her quiet life, away from the danger and chaos, or she could step into the unknown, embrace the opportunity to make a difference, and potentially change the course of her life forever. She thought about her family, about her future. She thought about all the people who had underestimated her, all the people who had seen her as nothing more than a maid. She thought about the truth she had fought for in that courtroom, the justice she had delivered when no one else believed it was possible. Angela looked at Dominic, her decision clear in her mind. "I'll join you," she said, her voice strong. "But not because you offered me power. I'll join you because I want to make a difference, to help people, to fight for what's right." Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the Mafia boss, the man who had learned something valuable. "I knew you were different," he said, a hint of a smile on his lips. "You'll be a force to be reckoned with, Angela." As she stood up to leave his office, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. The world had changed, and she had changed with it. No longer just a maid, no longer invisible, Angela had stepped into her own. And whatever came next, she was ready. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Angela knew she had the power to shape her own destiny. The days after Angela accepted Dominic's offer were a whirlwind. She had never imagined this life. From a maid who spent her days cleaning the mansions of the rich and powerful to a key player in one of the most dangerous empires in the city, Angela had taken a leap that few would ever dare to make. At first, it felt strange, the transition from scrubbing floors to attending high-level meetings, being part of conversations that shaped entire industries. But Dominic had kept his word. He didn't treat her like just another employee. He valued her opinions, listened to her suggestions, and included her in decisions that could change the direction of his business. It was overwhelming, but Angela felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. She had power, not the kind that came from wealth or violence, but from knowledge, intelligence, and truth. However, as the days passed, Angela began to realize that the price of power wasn't just the lifestyle, it was the constant threat that came with it. The Mafia world was not kind to the weak, and even those with power could be disposed of if they became a liability. Angela's new role came with more responsibility than she had expected. She had to navigate the complex and dangerous world of organized crime, where alliances were fragile and betrayal was a common currency. Dominic's empire, which seemed so powerful from the outside, had its cracks, and those cracks were widening. The higher she rose, the more Angela understood that nothing was as simple as it seemed. One afternoon, as Angela sat in Dominic's office, reviewing some documents, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see one of Dominic's trusted associates, Tony, a man who had been with Dominic for years, standing in the doorway. "Angela," he said, his voice cautious, "we need to talk." She could see the tension in his face, the unease in his posture. Something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, putting down the papers. Tony stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "There are rumors," he began. "Rumors that some people aren't happy with Dominic's recent decisions. Some of the old guard are worried about the changes he's been making." Angela's mind raced. She had heard whispers, but she hadn't thought much of them at first. Now, it seemed like they were more than just idle gossip. "What kind of rumors?" she asked, her voice steady. Tony hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. "Some of the families are getting restless," he said quietly. "They think Dominic's too soft. They want to go back to the old ways, no more of this business as usual nonsense. They want power, and they want it now." Angela's heart sank. She had seen this coming, but hearing it from Tony made it feel all too real. "What does Dominic think?" she asked. "He's not blind to what's going on," Tony replied. "But he's trying to do things differently. He's trying to change the way things have always been done. That's why he brought you in. He trusts you." The words echoed in Angela's mind. Dominic trusted her. But did that mean she was ready to navigate these dangerous waters? Was she prepared for the consequences of the trust she had earned? "What do we do?" Angela asked, her voice tight. We have to be careful, Tony said, his voice low. The wrong move could start a war. But we also can't let this fester. Dominic's too important to the city's balance. If we don't act, someone else will, and it won't be pretty. Angela took a deep breath. She had learned that in this world, hesitation was a death sentence. If she wanted to survive and continue to help Dominic, she had to act swiftly, but she had to be strategic. What's the next step? She asked. Tony nodded. You need to speak to Dominic. He needs to know what's coming. And you need to decide if you're with him in this or not. As Tony left the room, Angela's mind whirled. She had come so far in such a short time, but now she was faced with a decision that could change everything. She could turn her back, walk away, and never look back. Or she could take the risk, stand by Dominic, and help him face whatever storm was coming. She knew one thing for sure. If she stayed, she couldn't play it safe. The power she had worked so hard to gain could vanish just as quickly as it had appeared. But walking away wasn't an option. Angela had seen too much, learned too much, to walk away now. Dominic needed her, and she wasn't about to let him fall. The stakes were higher than ever, and Angela was ready to rise to the challenge. Whatever happened next, she was in this for the long haul. Angela walked down the hallway of the Romano estate, her thoughts heavy. The tension in the air was palpable as she prepared to meet Dominic. The past few days had been filled with uncertainty, whispers of betrayal, and looming threats. The old guard, the families that had once controlled everything, were restless. They weren't pleased with Dominic's new direction, and the time for change was running out. Angela had done everything she could to help Dominic navigate this world, but now the stakes were higher than ever. She couldn't afford to make mistakes, not with so much on the line. She arrived at Dominic's office, where he was waiting. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a look of deep concern. The world he had built, the empire he had carefully crafted, was now in jeopardy. Come in, he said as he saw her at the door, his voice flat, tired. Angela walked in and closed the door behind her. Dominic was seated at his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up at her, but there was something different in his eyes now. The guarded expression, the mask he wore to protect himself from everyone, had softened. We're in trouble, he said, without any preamble. The families are making their move. They want control. They want me out. Angela sat down across from him, the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. She knew this day was coming, but it still hit her harder than she expected. What do we do? She asked, her voice calm despite the chaos swirling inside her. Dominic leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city below. I don't know, he said quietly. I've tried everything, but they've got too much power. They've been in control for too long. Angela knew Dominic wasn't used to feeling helpless. He was the Mafia boss, the one who had always been in charge, the one who made decisions, who commanded respect. And now, here he was, uncertain of his next move. Angela took a deep breath. She couldn't afford to let the weight of this moment overwhelm her. She had been in difficult situations before, and she had always found a way out. This was no different. We fight, she said firmly, looking Dominic in the eye. We take the fight to them. Dominic raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. How? How do we take on the families when they have the power, the connections? Angela stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling city below. You've spent your life building this empire, Dominic. You've made enemies, but you've also made allies. You don't have to fight this alone. There are people who owe you, people who will stand by you. We need to rally them, show them that you're not just some mafia boss to be pushed around. Dominic's eyes followed her as she spoke. He had always seen himself as the one in control, but Angela was giving him a new perspective. A perspective he hadn't considered in years. You think they'll help me? He asked, his voice skeptical but filled with a hint of hope. Angela turned back to him, her gaze unwavering. I know they will, she said confidently. We've worked together before. And if we make the right moves, if we show them we're stronger together, we can take back control. Dominic was silent for a moment, processing her words. Then, slowly he nodded. You're right, he said, the resolve returning to his voice. We fight. We take back what's ours. The air in the room shifted, and for the first time in days, Angela felt a spark of hope. This was the moment when everything changed. The families would not win. Dominic would not fall. They would fight, not just for his empire, but for everything they had built together. The road ahead was dangerous, and Angela knew there would be casualties, but she was ready. They had already fought so hard to get here, and they weren't going to back down now. Let's make them regret ever thinking they could take us down, Angela said, her voice filled with determination. Dominic stood up, the familiar power returning to his stance. Let's do it. The next few days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and careful planning. Angela worked tirelessly, using every connection she had to rally those who still stood by Dominic. Some were hesitant, others were afraid, but Angela pushed forward. She knew that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. It was time to take action. On the night they planned to strike, Angela stood with Dominic, ready for whatever came next. The streets outside were quiet, the city asleep, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But Angela wasn't afraid. She had seen too much, learned too much, to be intimidated now. This was her moment, and she would fight for it. The families had underestimated her, just as they had underestimated Dominic. But now, they were about to learn that no one could take down the Romano Empire, not without a fight. The countdown to their final move had begun, and Angela was ready for whatever came next. The night of their final move had arrived. Angela stood with Dominic in his office, overlooking the city skyline, the weight of their plan heavy in the air. The city was quiet, but Angela knew that the calm before the storm was just that, calm. The Mafia families, the old guard, were about to feel the full force of what it meant to challenge Dominic Romano. Angela had played her part in planning the strategy, using her intelligence and insight to connect the dots, to see the cracks in their enemy's armor. But now it was time for action. Dominic had called in his loyal allies, those who still believed in him, those who had fought by his side for years. They were ready. The game was on. You ready? Dominic asked, his voice steady but filled with a hint of anticipation. Angela turned to him, her heart pounding. She had been a part of this world for long enough now to understand what was at stake. This wasn't just about power or money. It was about survival. Dominic's empire had been built on strength and fear, but Angela had shown him that intellect, strategy, and loyalty could be just as powerful. I'm ready, she said, her voice calm but resolute. Let's finish this. The plan had been set into motion. Dominic's most trusted allies were positioned across the city, waiting for the signal to act. Angela had made sure every detail was accounted for, every potential risk considered. But she knew that no plan was foolproof. There were always variables, always unknowns. As the clock ticked down, she felt the tension rise in the pit of her stomach. But she couldn't afford to show any fear. Not now. Dominic, sensing her unease, placed a hand on her shoulder. You've got this, he said quietly. We've got this. Angela nodded, grateful for his reassurance. In the past, she had been invisible, a quiet observer in a world full of noise and power. But now, she had a seat at the table. And this was her moment to prove that she belonged. The signal came, sharp and clear. The operation was underway. Angela watched as Dominic moved swiftly, confidently, giving orders to his men, his leadership unquestioned. The families that had once ruled with an iron fist were about to feel the consequences of their greed and betrayal. Angela wasn't afraid. She had seen this world up close, understood its dangers, and learned how to navigate it. She wasn't just fighting for Dominic anymore. She was fighting for herself, for everything she had worked for everything she had become. As the night unfolded, Angela stayed in constant communication with Dominic and the team. The old guard was falling one by one, their power slipping through their fingers as quickly as it had come. Angela had known it wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to be this swift. The families had underestimated Dominic, and in doing so, they had underestimated her as well. By the time dawn began to break, the city was different. The power had shifted. The old guard was no more. Dominic stood at the head of the table, the weight of his decisions heavy on his shoulders. But there was a sense of satisfaction in his eyes. The war had been won, and he had emerged victorious, not just because of his power, but because of the loyalty and intelligence he had now surrounded himself with. Angela, standing beside him, knew that this was only the beginning. The city was his again, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. The Mafia world was never static. Power was always in flux, always at risk. But in that moment, she knew that they had set a new course, one that could change everything. As the two of them stood there, surveying the aftermath of the night's events, Dominic turned to Angela. You were right, he said, his voice filled with both respect and gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you. Angela met his gaze, her eyes steady. You didn't need to do it alone, she replied. We did this together. Dominic smiled, the familiar, cold smile of the Mafia boss. But there was something different about it now. It wasn't just about control or power. It was about respect. And for the first time, Angela realized that she had earned that respect, not just from Dominic, but from the world around her. The storm had passed, but there would be more challenges ahead. Angela knew that. But as she looked at Dominic, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She had proven herself in the most dangerous world imaginable. And now, she was a force to be reckoned with. The days following their victory had been intense. Angela and Dominic had finally secured control, but Angela knew the Mafia world never let up. Power was fleeting, alliances were fragile, and the game was always changing. But for the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. She had earned her place in this world. She had proven herself, not just to Dominic, but to herself. The storm had passed, but Angela understood that a calm moment in the Mafia world was always short-lived. As the weeks went by, Dominic continued to rebuild, solidify his position, and strengthen his hold on the empire that had been so ruthlessly challenged. But Angela knew that they couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. There was still one more threat looming on the horizon, someone who had been waiting in the shadows, biding their time. One morning, as Angela entered the Romano estate, she found Dominic in his office, surrounded by papers and files. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable, but she could see the tiredness in his eyes. We have a problem, he said, his voice low. Angela raised an eyebrow. What kind of problem? The families, Dominic continued, his gaze steady. There are some who think the power shift isn't complete. They're still trying to find a way to challenge me, undermine my position. And I have reason to believe they're going to make their move soon. Angela's heart raced. She had known. This was coming, but it was different hearing Dominic say it. This time, they were up against something far more dangerous. Rivals who had been waiting for this moment. We can't let them take us down, Angela said, her voice firm. I didn't fight this hard to lose it now. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the respect in his eyes, the trust that had grown between them over the past weeks. I need you, Angela, he said quietly. You've shown me that there's more than just brute force to this game. You've taught me that there's power in being smart, in outthinking our enemies. Angela nodded. She knew this was where the real test would come. They had already faced so much, betrayal, power struggles, and uncertainty, but now they were in the final phase. The game was coming full circle, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. What's the plan? She asked, her mind already racing through potential strategies. We gather intel, Dominic replied. We find out who's behind this and where their strength lies. Then we strike, but we strike carefully. We don't want to start a war we're not ready for. Angela agreed. The key was precision. They had to be smarter, faster, and more strategic than their rivals. The Mafia world was all about power, but the ones who survived the longest were the ones who knew when to strike and when to wait. Over the next few days, Angela worked tirelessly with Dominic's most trusted associates. She gathered information, listened carefully, and pieced together the puzzle. The families were indeed planning something, but they were divided. Some still remained loyal to Dominic. Others were secretly working with the rival faction, trying to topple him. Angela knew they had to act quickly before the divided families found common ground. The more she worked, the clearer it became. There was one figure pulling the strings. A powerful man from the shadows, someone Angela had heard whispers of but never truly considered a threat until now. Giovanni Vasquez, a ruthless and calculating player in the Mafia world. He had been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had managed to stay in the background while the families focused on their infighting, but now, he was ready to take the throne for himself. We need to deal with Giovanni, Angela said one evening as she and Dominic reviewed their findings. Dominic nodded, his jaw clenched. I've heard enough about him to know he's dangerous. He's been quiet, but now I see why. He's been building alliances behind our backs, waiting for the right moment to make his move. Angela studied the information spread across the table. Giovanni was a master strategist. He had managed to infiltrate Dominic's ranks, sowing distrust among key members of the family. It would take more than just brute force to defeat him. They would need to outsmart him, strike where he least expected it. We need to act fast, Angela said. If Giovanni is going to make his move, we need to get ahead of him. We can't afford to let him get the upper hand. Dominic's eyes narrowed with determination. You're right. We take him out before he has the chance to make a play. The plan was set. They would use Giovanni's own strategies against him. They would plant misinformation, create distrust among his allies, and force him into a position where he had no choice but to make a move. But they would be ready for him. The night of the operation, Angela stood by Dominic's side once again. The weight of the situation was heavy, but she was calm. This was their moment to finish what they had started. They would defeat Giovanni, secure their position, and ensure that no one would challenge them again. As the night unfolded, Angela knew they were on the verge of something big, something that could solidify their place in the Mafia world for good. They weren't just fighting for control anymore. They were fighting for their legacy. The outcome of this final battle would determine everything. The plan to confront Giovanni Vasquez was set in motion. Dominic and Angela had carefully orchestrated every detail, but the moment of truth was fast approaching. They were on the brink of securing their position for good, but they knew that Giovanni wouldn't be taken down easily. He had spent years building his influence in the shadows, gaining the trust of key figures, and establishing his own power base. His reputation as a ruthless strategist and manipulator was well earned. Angela and Dominic knew that to defeat him, they would have to outsmart him at his own game. The night before the final move, Angela couldn't sleep. The tension in the air was thick, and the weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on her. She sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The quiet of the night was broken only by the sound of her own thoughts racing. It was strange to think how far she had come, from the quiet maid, invisible and overlooked, to the one who stood at the heart of a mafia empire, orchestrating one of the most dangerous moves of her life. The mafia world was never going to be easy, but Angela had found her place in it. She had proven that intellect and loyalty could be just as powerful as brute force. But as she sat there, waiting, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Dominic had been confident about their plan, but Giovanni was unpredictable. He always had a backup, a contingency. Angela knew this wouldn't be over until Giovanni was completely neutralized, and that meant they needed to be prepared for anything. As the hours passed, she felt her nerves settle. She had been in tight spots before, but never anything like this. This was it, the defining moment. The next morning, the plan began. They had spent weeks planting seeds of doubt, feeding misinformation, and aligning their most trusted allies with them. Angela had carefully crafted the strategy, ensuring that Giovanni would be the one to make the first move, exposing himself. She knew he wouldn't be able to resist. Dominic had called in his most loyal lieutenants, and Angela had worked behind the scenes, making sure their information was airtight. Giovanni would think he was playing them, but in reality, they were the ones in control. As the day unfolded, things seemed to go according to plan. Giovanni's allies began to turn on him. The alliances he had spent years cultivating began to fray. He grew more and more paranoid, unable to trust anyone around him. But then, just as Angela had predicted, Giovanni made his move. He initiated a meeting with a rival faction, trying to secure his hold before Dominic and Angela could strike. It was a desperate move, one born of fear and greed, but it was exactly what Angela had been waiting for. As soon as the meeting was set, Dominic, Angela, and their team moved into position. They weren't just going to confront Giovanni. They were going to eliminate his influence entirely, making sure that no one would follow him. Angela stood in the shadows, watching as Dominic and his men prepared for the final confrontation. The tension was unbearable. The plan was in motion, but nothing was ever guaranteed. Giovanni had proven time and again that he was a survivor, and even now, he was doing everything he could to keep his position. Angela wasn't going to let that happen. She had learned too much from Dominic, too much from this world, to let Giovanni succeed. She had become a force in her own right, and she wasn't going to let him undo everything they had worked for. The meeting took place in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, too quiet. The air was thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Giovanni arrived, flanked by a few of his remaining loyalists, but Angela could see that his confidence had faltered. He knew something wasn't right. Dominic stood across from him, his expression cold, unwavering. "This is it, Giovanni," Dominic said, his voice like ice. "You thought you could take me down, but you underestimated me. and you underestimated her. Angela stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Giovanni. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and disbelief. You, he sneered, the maid? You really think you've won? Angela didn't flinch. It's not about winning, Giovanni. It's about survival. And you've already lost. Before Giovanni could respond, Dominic made his move. The confrontation was quick, precise. Giovanni's supporters, realizing the betrayal, scattered. But it was too late. Dominic had already secured his position. Giovanni's empire crumbled, and with it, his influence. The families who had once followed him were now forced to reconsider their loyalty. As the dust settled and the tension eased, Angela stood there, feeling the weight of what had just happened. They had won. Giovanni was no longer a threat, and Dominic's position was secure. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as she had expected. She had learned that in this world, there were no true winners, only survivors. And Angela was determined to survive. She had done more than prove her worth. She had reshaped the power structure of the city. But as she looked at Dominic, she knew the real challenge was just beginning. The empire they had fought to build was still fragile, and new threats would emerge. But for now, they had won. And that, in this world, was enough. As the dust settled on the last battle, the reality of their victory began to sink in. Angela stood by the window of Dominic's office, looking out over the sprawling city. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden light across the skyline. It had been a long, brutal road to get here, but now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Angela could breathe. They had defeated Giovanni Vasquez and his faction, secured Dominic's empire, and proven that power alone wasn't enough to keep control. Intelligence, strategy, and loyalty, those were the keys to survival. Dominic had not only survived, but he had come out of this stronger than ever. His empire was now firmly in his hands again, and it was stronger than it had ever been. But Angela knew the fight wasn't truly over. In this world, nothing ever stayed static. But that was okay. She wasn't afraid of the fight anymore. The last few months had changed her. She had grown. She had learned how to navigate the dangerous underworld they lived in, and she had learned how to hold her own. More importantly, she had earned Dominic's respect, and not just as a maid. She was no longer just an employee to him. She was his partner, his confidant. And for once, she had found someone who truly saw her for who she was, not just the position she held. You did it, Dominic said, walking up behind her. His voice was quieter than usual, but there was a sincerity in it that Angela hadn't expected. She turned to face him, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. We did it, she replied with a soft smile. Together. Dominic smiled back, his gaze softening. I never thought I'd see the day, he said, his voice filled with both admiration and something deeper. I always thought power was the key to everything. But you've shown me something different. You've shown me that real strength comes from understanding, from seeing things with a clear head, and from having the courage to act on what's right. Angela didn't respond at first. His words hit harder than she expected. In this world, where violence and intimidation reigned, Dominic's acknowledgement of her intellect and loyalty meant more than any material reward. She had earned her place by his side, and now, she truly felt like she belonged. You've changed, too, Angela said, breaking the silence. You've always been a leader, but now, you're not just a boss. You're someone who understands that loyalty doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect. Dominic chuckled softly. I guess you could say I've learned a thing or two from you. The room was silent for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came after a battle, a silence that felt earned. The truth was, Angela knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be new challenges, new enemies, and old friends who would become rivals. But now, she wasn't just a passive observer in this world of power and danger. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Dominic knew it. So what happens now? She asked, breaking the silence. Dominic's eyes narrowed as he thought for a moment. Now, we make sure the empire is stronger than ever. We take control of the businesses, secure the alliances, and make sure no one ever thinks they can take us down again. But I won't do it alone. Not anymore. Angela's heart swelled with pride as she looked at him. He was right. This was the beginning of something bigger than either of them could have imagined. The Mafia world had tried to break them both. But instead of breaking, they had built something stronger together. As Dominic turned back toward the desk, he stopped and glanced at Angela. There's something else I've been thinking about, he said quietly. Angela raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's that? We've both been through a lot, Dominic said, his voice quieter than usual. And I know I've got a lot to learn. But there's one thing I know for sure. You're not just a maid anymore. You're not just an advisor either. You're someone who's earned my trust, my respect, and maybe even my loyalty. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that Dominic had a sense of respect for her, but to hear him say it, aloud, was something entirely different. She had come so far from the woman who had walked into this world, desperate for survival. She had not only survived, she had thrived. And now, standing beside Dominic, she realized that she had truly earned her place. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly, her voice steady. I'm here for the long haul. Dominic nodded, his eyes softening with something deeper than just respect. Good, he said, because this empire is ours now. The two of them stood there for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling into a comfortable silence. Angela had proven her worth, and in doing so, she had found something far more valuable than power. She had found a partnership, a future, and for the first time in her life, a place where she truly belonged. The road ahead was uncertain, but Angela knew one thing for sure. No matter what came their way, she would face it with Dominic by her side. Together, they were unstoppable,